morning, and thank you, Dara and Alexis. Happy Friday to everyone. With spring and real spring weather on the horizon and current vaccinations underway, Fridays are actually starting to feel like Fridays, socially distanced and all. And I hope that you all are taking every advantage and appreciating every blessing during this time. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our April bi-monthly update, which gives us a close look into the blueprint for Maryland's future, also known as the Kirwan Commission recommendations. But first, I want to celebrate. This idea started 5 years ago through many twists and turns. And the idea of seizing a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation opportunity to invest in education and improve academic experiences and outcomes for all children, especially in places and who live in circumstances where opportunity and resources are lacking, seemed like a crazy idea to some, but not to many people on this call, and certainly not to the efforts that rallied to make this happen. As you all know, BCF has had a long-standing commitment to supporting education efforts that alter for the better children's lives. From joining a coalition to advocate, this is now 10 years ago, for new 21st century schools in Baltimore, to later on working with donors, many of whom are on this call, to expand early learning and kindergarten readiness by growing Judy centers in Baltimore, to most recently helping to close the digital divide so that students who were locked in their homes, so to speak, could access learning during the pandemic. Our support, with your help, of the Kirwan Commission has just been core to everything that we believe in at BCF. And we just want to thank you all for that continued trajectory and support. So this blueprint for Maryland's future represents the collective action of people of all places, circumstances, and resources, placing a stake in the ground to invest in public education. So congratulations to you all and to us all for getting it done for children. We get to hear from the experts today. Shamoyia Gardiner, the newly appointed Executive Director of Strong Schools Maryland, and Melissa Broome, Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for Baltimore City Public Schools. If they will indulge me, I will give a quick overview and bio so that you can appreciate all of their fabulousness. So Shamoyia is the newly appointed Executive Director of Strong Schools Maryland, but she's been in this work for a long time, having served as the previous Deputy Director of Strong Schools. She is a first-generation American, first-generation college student, and former educator from Miami, Florida. Due in part to her identities and experiences, Shamoyia is determined that life is best spent working on the intersection of high-quality education, youth engagement, and political efficacy. Shamoyia earned her master's in education policy and leadership from American University and earned her undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Florida. Shamoyia's other professional experiences include leading the education policy portfolio at Advocates for Children and Youth and project-based work with the Institute for Higher Education Policy, the DC State Board of Education, Atlanta Public Schools, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Atlanta Civic Sites. Our other speaker is Melissa Broome, joined the Baltimore City Public School System in 2016 as the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs under the then newly appointed Santa Lisa's administration. With significant knowledge and experience in government relations, legislative strategy, and coalition building, Melissa is responsible for advancing City Schools' public policy agenda, particularly as it relates to the blueprint for Maryland's future. Prior to joining City Schools, Melissa spent a decade at the Job Opportunities Task Force, where she served as senior policy advocate and later as the deputy director. In 2015, she was recognized by President Obama as a White House champion of change for working families. Melissa holds a bachelor's degree and an MBA from Loyola University of Maryland. All right, so we're going to welcome our guests and thank them for their time and efforts in advocacy. And I am pleased to share this portion of our morning with Shamoyia Gardiner, who will talk to us about the what, the why, and why we're happy about the passage of the blueprint. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sauls. Good morning, everyone. If I could get my slides up, please. Thank you so much, Alexis. So good morning again, everyone. Shamoyia Gardiner, Executive Director of Strong Schools Maryland, here to give you all a 2021 update on the blueprint for Maryland's future and discuss what is next. Next slide, please. By now, hopefully you are all familiar with the 5 major policy areas that the Kirwan Commission spent time and several years fleshing out to develop the blueprint for Maryland's future. I will not go over the 5, but instead describe some examples of specific programs that you can expect to see get underway over the course of the next several years. So within that first area of early childhood education is bringing more Judy centers, those early learning centers, and Patty centers, what we formerly called family support centers, online and into communities so that families, especially those with young children, can access the resources they need immediately. We're also going to see the advancement of pre-K for all 4-year-olds in the state and all 3-year-olds from low-wealth families, and this will be through a mixed public and private delivery system. Third is the increased qualification and certification standards for everyone providing early childhood education in the state. Under high quality and diverse teachers and leaders, we'll see a new career ladder for educators that is tied to national board certification, as well as the investment of resources to support candidates from historically Black colleges and universities, minority serving institutions in particular, with achieving the requirements necessary to gain national board certification. This is an attempt to build some equity into the structures that create our high quality and diverse teacher workforce. We also see increased qualification and certification standards for teachers as well as for school administrators. Under college and career readiness, there will be the development of a new college and career readiness standard by which all 10th graders in the state will actually be determined college and career ready. If they are not determined college and career ready by the 10th grade, additional resources will be allocated to support those students in meeting that benchmark by graduation. There's also the formation of a career and technical education committee that will be doing a lot of the oversight work with regard to this, and it will be comprised of folks from education as well as the workforce sector to ensure that there is actual communication happening and that graduates, when they finish their apprenticeships and graduate high school with their industry recognized certifications, that our students are actually able to get into family sustaining jobs with high wages. The fourth area will, of course, include the expansion of community schools, something that folks in Baltimore City are no stranger to. We lead the state in the community schools model, and this fourth area includes a new concentration of poverty funding stream, which to our knowledge is the first in the nation for any state to try to include embedded in its education funding formula a specific stream to address schools and students in high concentrations of poverty, not just if an individual qualifies for free and reduced price meals, but if there is that concentration, recognizing there are additional resources necessary there. In addition to that, there's transitional supplemental instruction for early learners up to the 3rd grade to ensure that they're getting back on track before some of the predictors that we know will end up with unsuccessful outcomes start to set in. Finally, this investment is billions of dollars over the 10-year implementation period, and it is well worth it, but it does require strong governance and accountability system. That is why the blueprint includes the formation of an accountability and implementation board, which will be responsible for the 10-year implementation. They are the ultimate authority there, even superseding the state board in some instances. We're also seeing the creation of expert review teams who will come to individual schools in the event that they are not meeting standards set by the accountability and implementation board, not to be punitive, but to determine why it is the schools are having trouble meeting those benchmarks and then supporting them with the investments necessary to get there. And beyond that, the blueprint also requires that there is community engagement as a part of the governance and accountability work, and a particular responsibility of the accountability and implementation board. This is something that we don't often see in state level policy and are hoping to really build on over the 10-year implementation period. Next slide, please. So, excellent, thanks. A brief history of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. You know, we began this work in 2016 when the General Assembly passed legislation that created the Kirwan Commission. It took several years, multiple things were going on. At the height of the 2018 Fix the Gap effort when city schools was facing, I believe, $180 million projected shortfall in the upcoming budget. That was one of the moments when the Kirwan Commission's work really intersected with real-time needs of students in schools and really began to get light implementation underway. We fast forward now to 2021. You all know that the Blueprint veto override was successful this legislative session. It happened in early February, but what a lot of people don't know is that after that, we had to pass companion legislation to the Blueprint. What that companion legislation did was update the implementation timelines. It is a nearly 250-page document that is very finely tuned. And when the governor vetoed the Blueprint in May of 2020, he threw a lot of things out of whack. So in order to get on track and ensure that we're doing this as effectively as possible, they had to pass new legislation to update timelines. They also took that opportunity to address the enrollment losses that school systems across the state had seen in light of the pandemic by using funds from the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund to make school systems whole. And that is a use of the Blueprint Fund that we did not expect, but we're going to talk about later how the legislature came around to close the loop on that. Next slide, please. So you all know that it was also a historic legislative session. We were virtual. We did not get to do many of the things that we enjoy doing, like lobby nights and catching legislators in hallways. But what we did do was get very creative. Strong Schools Maryland partnered with the Maryland State Educators Association to produce these cardboard cutouts of real life students and staff and line lawyers, as legislators headed in and out to conduct their votes to remind them why it was important to complete that veto override. Next slide, please. So the completed veto override happened in early February, and then a couple of weeks later, I believe it was March 9th, this Blueprint 2.0 bill was introduced. So I gave an overview earlier. Here are some specific attributes of the 2.0 bill, also called House Bill 1372, that contribute to the effective implementation of the Blueprint. So we've talked about the fact that we made school districts whole by addressing the enrollment loss issues they saw. What the bill basically does is eliminate the school year 2020-21 data from future calculations for funding schools. And this is only going to be necessary over the next several years because these rolling calculations tend to happen in a 3-year timeline. And as the bill is written, we basically just ignore what happened this year. There's also an increase to the per pupil foundation amount in the state funding formula beginning in fiscal year 25 to account for education technology needs that we know students have. The need for devices, access to broadband, and IT support staff are included and will be embedded in the funding formula from fiscal 25 on. There's also an immediate increase in Judy Center funding. We know that early learning has suffered over the course of the pandemic, but we also know that by providing immediate access to Judy Centers, which will now be fully funded at $330,000 per center per year of federal standard, we know that by investing in this now, which is what the 2.0 bill does, we're going to get our students back on track much more quickly and ensure that they are ready to enter school, whatever school looks like at the time that they re-enter. This also speeds up the implementation of per pupil operating dollars. And what that actually translates to is when a school is designated as a community school under the Blueprint because of the poverty level that its student enrollment is at, that implementation was supposed to take place over, I believe, a period of almost 9 years. So very incrementally, the school would get the funding for the community school coordinator and the school-based health services practitioner in the first year, but then slowly receive a portion of the per pupil funding that goes on top of that. That's that new concentration of poverty funding stream I was talking about earlier. It's about $3,200 per student in a qualifying school. What the Blueprint 2.0 does is speed that up so that more funding is going directly to schools quicker, and implementation to become a fully funded community school will happen in about 7 years, which is a significantly shorter time frame than it otherwise would have been. There is also the establishment of some timeline for action around the creation of the nominating committee and accountability and implementation board. This was done specifically to prevent the governor from holding up any aspect of implementation. And we expect that by July 1st, at the very latest, we will know who the members of the accountability and implementation board are. And there's some clarification that the King Amendment, which is the trigger that would have stopped us from funding the blueprint if the state's budget couldn't handle it, we know that that was addressed as well. There is a quick intersection if you are also interested in youth justice in education. There is a bill passed. We do not know if the governor will allow it to stand, but it establishes a Board of Juvenile Services Education within the Department of Juvenile Services, complete with its own Board of Education and superintendent, and that system would be subject to the blueprint and be required to submit an implementation plan after a certain time period as well. Next, please. So the question that often comes up, and for some reason we're still getting, even though we've already completed the veto override, is can we afford this? Is this really feasible? The answer always has to be yes, no matter what, because of the students that we are doing this for and because this is our future. But I want to give you all some tangible, concrete reasons as to why it is that we can afford this. One, we know that, and excuse me, that's a typo, that is supposed to be the fiscal year 20, not 22. Fiscal year 20 ended on June 30th of last year, and it ended with the state in a position about $700 million better than we expected to be. And this is after the governor vetoed the blueprint for reasons related to cost, and the Board of Public Works considered making some major cuts to public education, $704 million better than we expected. Even prior to the legislative session, the Spending Affordability Committee, which tells the governor how much money we have to play with in the upcoming budget, projected that we had enough to fund the blueprint through fiscal year 26. And this was prior to the Relief Act at the federal level, prior to this legislative session. So we had more than enough money. The Blueprint Fund is funded through a combination of online sales tax revenue, which over the course of the pandemic shot through the roof as folks bought things online more and paid those taxes. And then legislation was also passed this session that allows some specifications around sports betting and fantasy gaming wagering in the state. There is revenue projected to be about $77 million headed to the Blueprint Fund by fiscal year 26. And I put an asterisk next to that because the projected revenue from online sales tax was nowhere near what it was because of the pandemic. There are a lot of other external factors that could impact that number that we can expect to see go into the fund. And of course, there's also digital ad revenue. We know that the legislation, the General Assembly just overrode the veto on, may be tied up in the courts for some time, but eventually, if and when that is fully implemented, we can expect to see that additional revenue. The state's general fund is also expected to contribute about $40 million per year over the implementation time of the blueprint. And if $40 million a year sounds like a lot, I understand that, but this is in the context of a $47 billion state budget. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the state's actual contribution to the blueprint. If you could click one more time, Alexis. On the left-hand side, there's some information here that I'd like to use to complicate assumptions. This graph demonstrates the total state aid to local governments, and I just cut out the pieces that were relevant to the implementation of the blueprint. There's significantly more money than this, but one of the issues that folks are concerned about, and rightly so, is the increased contribution that local government is going to have to give over the implementation timeline. There is absolutely a question of equity to be worked out, but the bottom line is that local governments do have to come up with a compensatory education for special education, English language learners, and students in poverty. They have to come up with their end. So the blueprint does require that increased funding. It is also worth noting that the state as a part of implementing the blueprint is giving funding to local governments. So what I don't want folks to walk away with is the impression that the blueprint is just costing and costing and costing, because some of the cost of the blueprint is sort of recycled in how the funding is allocated to local government. There are absolutely increases that need to be made and shifts that'll have to be made at the local level for some folks to come up with their share over time. And that is a larger question of tax policy and the state of us economically. But the key thing here to realize is that we are increasing our investment from the state level into local government by over $400 million in this upcoming budget year. And that is not insignificant. Next, please. On the right-hand side of the slide, the question is, of course, how much money can Baltimore City expect to get from this upcoming implementation of the blueprint? These are my numbers from the DLS 90-day report. Melissa, if I'm incorrect, please let me know, but we can expect about $129 million, which should be an increase of about $48 million from last year. Next slide, please. And then finally, there's federal funding. I talked earlier about the fact that we use some blueprint funding at the state level to make school districts whole. In the 5th supplemental budget, which is unheard of in a legislative session, getting 5 of these, the General Assembly went and took that federal relief funding and filled up the blueprint to make that account whole as well. And we can expect additional investment coming. We know that Senator Van Hollen, amongst many others, have been champions of increasing public education funding, particularly here in the state. Next slide, please. So the last thing that I will leave you with is get familiar with this concept of implementation. Yes, I am the new executive director of Strong Schools Maryland, and many of us know us as simply a legislative campaign. I am deeply interested in policy, a wonk, and I recognize that the most important thing about policy is the outcomes that it achieves for people. But when we talk about funding, advocacy, and initiatives and what makes headlines, folks focus on what happens during the legislative session, and we tend not to talk about implementation until there's a problem down the line, until money is misallocated. What we are hoping to do is engage community members the same way we did in legislative advocacy over the last several years in the implementation process, so that they know who leads their county board of education, when meetings are, how regulations are drafted, and how to pull at some of those levers to get the impacts needed for their community. There are multiple ways to get involved if you're interested. Your word, actions matter. Communication matters as well. Please visit our website. And feel free to reach out to me. Our general email address is hello@strongschoolsmaryland.org. Mine is shamoyia@strongschoolsmaryland.org, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shamoyia. That was very comprehensive. So well done. And now we're going to sort of take a look at what the blueprint means specifically in Baltimore City Public Schools. And so I'm delighted to have Melissa share with us, and thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me. On behalf of Dr. Santelises and Chief of Staff Allison Perkins Cohen, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today, even though I think you just got more from Shamoyia about the intricacies of this than anyone could ever hope for. So I will do my best to just provide some context for what this really means for us as the school system. I know many of you are very familiar with what a long journey this has been with this bill, and I thought Shamoyia's timeline of the years, seeing them like that, this has been a long time coming, and we still have a ways to go. But I want to, if you could go to the next slide, please. I want to quickly just remind everyone of some of the history in Baltimore City and why this effort has been so critical to us. Many of you probably know this like the back of your hand, but for some who may not be as familiar, I want to just quickly go through a couple historical pieces. And so this first slide just lets you know, not surprisingly, our largest priority this legislative session was ensuring that that the legislature did indeed override the governor's veto. And now that it's all done and we're all breathing a sigh of relief, it sounds like it just happened, but none of this just happened. And there really was no guarantee, even going into this session. You have to remember like how we ended last year, right? Like session got cut short for the first time, I think since the Civil War. People just kind of left Annapolis, and then this veto happened, and then the pandemic happened. So even preparing to head back in January, and as Shamoyia said, head back virtually, we didn't know. There was no guarantee. And I want to say that because I think particularly for Strong Schools Maryland and under Shamoyia, and many of you knew or know Joe as well, this is not something that happened overnight. And I personally just appreciate so much the chance to work with them in my role as, being the system, so to speak. There was such a huge effort that they coordinate behind the scenes. I mean, some of it's behind the scenes, some of it's very public, but with advocates from all over the state that were meeting every week, through Zoom, but meeting to figure out the best next steps to get this done. And I don't ever want to minimize how much work that they do. And I and all of us at City Schools appreciate the chance to interact with them and try to be on the same page as much as possible. That's how things get done. So I just want to mention that. So again, our biggest priority was getting the veto overridden of Kirwan. And while I'm not going to focus on it today, it's worth reminding everyone that the other huge bill that passed last year was the Built to Learn Act, which is a school facilities funding for school districts. I'm sure that Baltimore City is home to the oldest portfolio of school buildings in the state. And Built to Learn was critical for us being able to move forward with phase 2 of our 21st century plan. When things came to a head last year, there was a measure introduced to tie these bills together, basically to say that Built to Learn, which was very much supported by, Built to Learn tends to have more bipartisan support. So there was a effort to say that unless that Built to Learn could no longer be implemented unless Kirwan was implemented. So I just want to remind people of that, because that, while we're not focused on it today, is another huge piece of this pie for city schools and our future. Next slide, please. So Shamoyia touched on this. I'll just say it very briefly. You'll remember very soon after Dr. Santelises took over as CEO, we announced a $180 million budget gap. Let me take that back, $130 million annual budget gap. And so as part of back then trying to get Kirwan moving and trying to just keep city schools afloat, we passed, I like how Shamoyia called it Kirwan Light. I tend to call it Baby Kirwan, Bridge to Kirwan, whatever nickname you want, but something to get us through for 3 years, where city schools would receive an extra $60 million a year to try and close that gap. But remember, $60 million is not $130 million. And that is how we have been operating for the past several years. And it's also, I just say that as a reminder for why something had to happen with Kirwan. Next slide, please. Again, I think hopefully everybody has these numbers ingrained forever in their brains, but just in case, it's really worth remembering and understanding that outside education experts, sorry, no one ever calls my home phone, I apologize. Outside education experts back around the time that the adequacy report was being prepared for the Kirwan Commission, this is not us saying this is others that do this for a living, found that city schools needs an additional $358 million a year just to achieve adequacy for our students. And a similar report from the state's Department of Legislative Services, which is a completely independent entity, found that if the Thornton formula if it had kept pace with inflation the way it was supposed to, and this is important because I'm going to come back to this at the end, that we would have been receiving an extra $342 million under the current formula. And I've already talked about, just again, as a reminder, our facilities challenges, which are easily upwards of $1 billion. Next slide, please. So So as Shamoyia mentioned, when the legislature reconvened this year and they did succeed in overriding the veto, they knew they had to pass a separate bill in order to make, at its most basic level, to bring implementation into alignment with the fact that there had been a year-long delay. What we did at City Schools, and with the help of many advocates, was went to the legislature and said, well, particularly our leaders in the city delegation, and said, this was already, Kirwan was already important pre-pandemic. It's now just, there's no way to overstate the importance of this legislation. And we feel that you all and your colleagues should figure out some things you can do in this companion legislation to speed up support to the districts that already faced the largest challenges and the biggest adequacy gaps. And I'm, Shamoyia alluded to this. We were successful with some things that we got done. So particularly accelerating the timeline for the concentrations of poverty per pupil grants. So for the past couple of years under the Bridge to Kirwan, we've been receiving the school-based grants for schools with 85% poverty and higher. There was no guarantee, given this year-long delay, while the per pupil grants were supposed to start next year, that wasn't, again, no guarantee because everything had been pushed out a year. So it's not a small accomplishment that the per pupil funding will indeed start next year for schools with, again, 85% poverty or more. And not only is it starting, but originally under the original legislation, school systems would have received a little more than 12% of those grants initially. And thanks to the work this year and help from our leaders in the General Assembly, it's going to move from 12% to 16% in the first year. And Shamoyia also touched on that instead of it taking 9 years to reach the full amount of those grants, it's now only going to take 7 years. The other piece, and this gets really far out, but the other thing that we were successful in doing is saying for that any schools that become eligible in the out years, so 2030 and beyond, once we get there where we've reached full implementation of the blueprint, that any schools coming into the fold at that time should receive 100% of those grants up front right away. And we also were successful in getting that amended into the bill. And then the reporting and accountability requirements, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are still some challenges there. School systems are going to be required still to be reporting on things before they have the full access to these funds. So that's going to be something we'll all be watching and doing our best with, but there is a lot that's coming down the pike in terms of what they call accountability, which we understand and certainly understand, but there will be some challenges that I'm sure we will be sharing with you when the time comes. Next slide, please. So I wanted to, I'm sorry, the font's a little wacky on the surrounding counties. I wanted to include this slide just to give, Shamoyia touched on this too. It is beyond significant that Maryland's General Assembly has acknowledged that concentrations of poverty matter. If you go way back to the start of all this, when you go way back to the beginning, this was something we had to fight for. This was something we advocates, and people who know this work really had to convince the Kirwan Commission that the concentration matters, that a school with, 3 students that are deemed low income is different than a school where 90% of the children are low income, that you need more support in those schools. I know to most of us, that probably doesn't sound like rocket science, but this was not an easy lift. So it's huge. And it's really, for Baltimore City, it is how we will receive the bulk of our support under this new method of how we're gonna do public education in Maryland. And so I just wanted, for comparison's sake, because it still stops me a little bit when I see the reality, right? That in school year 2021, we had 121 schools that qualified for support under this designation. And I say that in comparison to surrounding counties, right? Baltimore County, 10, Anne Arundel, 9, Hartford, 4. I mean, it's, we all know that we are in this work and committed to this work because of the population we serve. But I think when you see it that way in such stark numbers, it's just a reminder to all of us of how big the need is in our city. I think many of you know, because this has been established, but that school systems that have at least 40 of these schools are given some flexibility with how the funds are received and dispersed. And we have some flexibility that to spend any excess funds in a way that we can address wraparound services, a really core, which I think I have on the next slide, a list of what some of those wraparound services are. I want to bring that up because something that, that you wouldn't necessarily know unless you live and breathe Annapolis is that at one point this session, there was an effort during one of these iterations of the Kirwan 2.0 or the companion legislation to strip that ability to use those funds for wraparound services and instead limit those funds now to only being for health services. We all understand, you can imagine, I can understand why someone might, someone, especially not from Baltimore City, a legislator not from Baltimore City might think it's a pandemic, let's, strip everything and only focus on healthcare. But that would have been catastrophic for us because of all that we have been able to do in terms of providing more to our students with those wraparound services. That was a quiet thing that happened. It happened late at night, and within a couple of days, we were able to work behind the scenes and get that removed. So it's not something you're going to hear about in the press, but I just share that to, again, just share a lot happens in Annapolis that doesn't necessarily make the news, but is really important to us. So we were glad to get that done. This list just shows you some of what, again, I hope everyone here at this point is familiar with these things, but these are some of the priorities and priorities that have long been priorities and will continue to be moving forward. And we just want to make sure we preserve our ability to do these things. Next slide, please. So I wanted to end today by just saying and sharing with all of you that there's so much to be celebrated. Obviously, there's a lot to be proud of. This is been years in the making, and it's actually here. And there's something about that that's amazing. But it's really important at the same time to understand that this work now is just getting started. I mean, Shamoyia mentioned this at the end of her presentation as well. We have a decade almost, right? I mean, we do a decade of this needing to be preserved, that this model, this timeline, the phase-ins, that we have to preserve them. And so when you think about, I mean, I know we have a little time, but the next governor, the next, like everything coming down the pike in our state is we cannot say, okay, this is done and go home, or just get, kind of say we're finished, because there's a lot, we saw it with Thornton, we saw what happened, where no one knows what the long-term economic impact of COVID is going to be. And so much why it was important to be doing things like lining Lawyers Mall with cutouts this year. It's going to be just as important to stay vigilant especially in these next few years, but for the long haul, to make sure that this remains a priority for folks in Annapolis. This, it happened and it's great, but it wasn't, again, like it wasn't without intense floor debate this year. I don't know if any of you got to hear the debate on the House floor, where Baltimore City was talked about at length, city schools. Really, I mean, if you want to just feel, I'm trying not to be too, I like being upbeat and not sad, but like, if you want to hear, have a real understanding of what many legislators in other parts of the state think about what goes on in Baltimore City, this will just horrify you. Luckily, we do have leaders that were able to get up and fight back and explain why this rhetoric that they're repeating that they hear from certain news stations. I just share this to say, like, that was a very, very long debate on the House floor in response to support for us and for our students. And so this road ahead the challenges aren't going to go away, and we have to make sure that we don't see a repeat of what we've seen in the past when Maryland has tried to do things like this. So we'll keep you posted. I really appreciate the chance to just touch on some of this today, and to be a part of this conversation, and I'm happy to take any questions.